Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Storytime with me. I'm Bucho, I'm your host and author, reading a new story that I just completed last weekend called Vestige. It's going to be in my next collection, which is titled Under a Black Rainbow. It's super dark, it's very surreal. I don't know that I'd talk too much about it, but I'm basically trying to push the boundaries of how dark I can take a story and still have it be worth reading. It's been a fun experiment. I really like a lot of the stories that are done. I believe there are 19 that I've completed so far, and I'm hoping to have 34 done. It will definitely be the largest project I've completed so far, also the darkest. But I'm really happy with a lot of the results, and some of the publishers have really liked what they've read so far as well. So this piece, like I said, was completed last weekend. It was the first one I've really done any work on over the last year, both due to the pandemic and due to my father's death, which I imagine hampered my creativity considerably for a number of reasons. It wasn't until I finished writing this that I realized that this might have been a good story to kind of process some of those things that I was not vocalizing or maybe intentionally dealing with, even though the story doesn't necessarily run that same parallel. I mean, it kind of does, but not really. Anyway, I'm going to read it off of my laptop rather than a printed version because I don't have a printer here at the house, so apologies if this seems a little rickety as I read, but I hope you enjoy. And then, when the sickness had consumed him, and the child finally took its last breath, the mother and father buried his lifeless body in a shallow hole of soft dirt halfway between the home and the property line. The father woke up early, slipped on his dirty overalls from the day before, and dug a deeper grave than he'd intended, stopping only as the sun began to rise. It was a simple burial. There was no preacher to give them peace, no other family there to give them solace. The child died in the night and was buried in the morning. The mother wept silently as the father read a verse from the tattered family Bible. Only would she turn to go back to the house did he allow himself the luxury of a few silent tears in private. As the months passed, a small but persistent banyan sapling sprouted from the grave. Despite the raging winds of autumn, the bitter frost of winter, the perpetual rains of spring, and the hard drought of summer, the sapling remained strong and alive. Its branches grew slowly, the skinny blossomed fists reaching for the heavens. With neither rhyme nor reason, the father came to mistrust the tree that had taken root in his yard. From the porch where he and the mother sat to watch the sunset each evening, he could see the ground bowing up and out from under the roots that had begun to wind their way throughout the soil, hungry for whatever nutrients lie beneath. "It's not natural," he muttered one night as they sat sipping their iced teas, staring out into the yard. "It's not right." The mother made a non-committal noise and continued staring off toward the horizon. She had learned to let him air his grievances until he had tired of talking about them. He would wear himself out fighting a battle against himself, and they would sleep without having fought with each other. This was her way of not going to bed angry, a bit of advice her mother passed along on their wedding night so many years previous. "I don't understand why that damn tree had to grow right there," he lamented. "It's disrespectful." He grunted, approving of his own opinion, and sipped the last of his tea loudly. The mother clucked her tongue as if she agreed, though she did not, for the Lord had his ways. He put the glass down on the table between them, stood up, popped his back, and marched out to the middle of the lot where the sapling stood in defiance. Cartoonishly, he spat in both hands, rubbed them together, and grabbed hold of the base of the sapling, hoping to pull the whole damn thing out, roots and all. Neither the ground nor the thin trunk to be gave him an inch of anything, though he strained against it for several minutes, changing his grip every so often as if different leverage was the solution. His arms began to ache, and he could feel that tricky bit in his back start to do the same. From the porch, the mother could see his ruddy cheeks brightening at the strain. She watched as he pulled out his back pocket kerchief to wipe his forehead before deciding to march to the shed on the side of the house. "What you fixin' to do, honey?" she asked. "I ain't fixin' to do nothin'. By hook or by crook, that sapling is coming out of the ground and getting thrown into a bonfire," he yelled over his shoulder. The mother rolled her eyes. "Okay, dear." From the porch, she could hear the banging of him moving tools and farming implements around in the darkened shed. A few minutes later, he emerged with an axe slung across his shoulder and walked briskly across the lawn. The mother watched as he geared up to swing, twirling the axe in his hand like he was a younger version of himself. Marvin rested the head of the axe on the ground and spat in his hands again before clutching it tight. "I expect those hands to be washed before you find your way to our marital bed," she said, disapprovingly, pouring another glass of tea. "Yes, dear," he said more to himself than to her. He pulled the axe back and swung down hard at the base of the sapling. Unbelievably, the axe blade seemed to bounce off the thin trunk like it was made of hard rubber. Marvin's mumbled swears carried across the yard. "Language, dear," she said loudly. "Uh-huh," he muttered back, wondering how the blade had missed the sapling completely, its head buried in the surrounding dirt, somehow missing every single one of the visible roots. He dislodged the axe from the ground and swung again. Though he had struck the sapling straight on, he knew he had. The blade seemed to bounce off its surface again, this time knocking him off balance and nearly putting him on the ground. He swore profusely under his breath. "God damn it, Marvin, I said language." Yeah, he muttered to himself, dislodging the axe again. "If it can't be cut, it damn well better burn." He strode back to the shed, frustrated, and put the axe back in its place. When he came back, he was carrying a can of gasoline normally reserved for the tractors. The mother saw this and made the sign of the cross before heading inside with their glasses and the empty pitcher. "Just be careful, dear," she yelled as she entered the house. The storm door banged shut behind her, and she could hear the sound of Marvin dousing the sapling in gasoline. She emptied the glasses and the nearly empty pitcher into the sink. Even from this far away, she could hear his satisfied hollering as he lit the fluid and the flames came to life, crackling and dancing in the yard. And then, silence. She shook her head as she rinsed out the glassware and placed it all face down on a towel to dry. Of course he'd done something to make the situation worse. Of course he had. She wondered if she'd have to take him to the hospital again as she dried off her hands and walked back out to the yard. Marvin stood there, dumbfounded, the entire front of his body covered in soot and ash and smoke. Little gray wisps danced around his body and dissipated in the air above him, swirling out into the night. His hands were up in the air as if to protect his face. While most of the smoke had disappeared, the smell of it hung thick and heavy on the breeze, tainting everything in the immediate area. The sapling was gone. In its place was a much thicker, taller tree, with more and darker branches, with more and greener leaves. It had grown into a full and beautiful adult banyan in seconds, the reddish sunset spilling around its silhouette and creating deep dappling on the ground below. That night, the mother undressed and bathed Marvin, who remained in shock long after the event. Every bare bit of skin had been completely covered in black soot and burn, though Marvin experienced no serious injuries. When she removed his shirt and pants, she could see the clear lines along his skin where the fabric had protected him from the ashen blast. Parts of him were so covered she would later laugh at the image of Marvin appearing to wear fancy black gloves all the way up to his elbows. First she showered him, rinsing the entire day off of him with water as hot as he could stand it before scrubbing him hard with a loofah. Ash and soap eddied around his ankles, staining the side of the tub in deep gray. Throughout, he said nothing and simply stared ahead at the shower wall. Next, she plugged the drain and let the tub fill, steam billowing up around them as she helped him down into the water. She leaned his head back on a towel against the wall and took a clean wash rag to his face and neck, his shoulders, chest, and arms. Soon the only sound was her hand sponging up water, the water rippling behind, and then the sponge squeezed out along Marvin's body. Once done, she dried him off, helped him into his pajamas, and put him to bed. Though the tree could be easily seen from their bedroom window, the mother avoided making eye contact with it. She drew the shade down and sat in the rocking chair on her side of the bed. She watched over Marvin as he slept, his aging body rising and falling with each exhalation, his snores unzipping the silence over and over again. Normally this was the only time of day she could see his face free of stress. Some nights a tiny smile would appear as he slept, and she'd be able to finally allow herself to fall into her own dreams. Most nights, however, she only waited until his face went slack-jawed and loose, knowing he was elsewhere then, the day quickly becoming a distant memory. When this happened, she'd rise from the chair and join him in bed, the noisy rhythm of his snores lulling her to sleep. That night, Marvin dreamt. He dreamt of a massive tree whose roots had slithered into the home and had taken him prisoner. He dreamt that those roots began to penetrate his every pore and to come back out through others, crisscrossing his insides like bad stitching while gently expanding his body before slowly ripping him apart. He wanted to scream, but he could feel one of the tendrils slithering up his throat to fill his mouth before it silenced him. All went black. Marvin found himself tightly compacted in a small place, his arms pinned straight down to his sides, immobile. He had the unnerving feeling that, had you sliced him open, the cutaway of his body would have rings to count inside that would add up perfectly to his age, and then the age of his father, and then the age of his father, and so on down the familial line. He could only look straight forward out into the blackness, but he could feel his fingers and toes branching out, lengthening into something else entirely. The grassy expanse beneath his feet gave way to the expanse of wilting vegetation. Slowly, his entire body seemed to sag, as if the weight of all his worries had been the only thing keeping him upright. The entire structure of his form sank into itself before spiraling back up and out. He could feel his skin begin to harden, starting at his feet and creeping up until he could feel wooden tendrils crawl along his neck and over his head. His body became cemented in place as the black came and swallowed him up whole. And then it was morning again. Marvin sat up in bed, panting heavily, every inch of his body covered in cold sweat. After lunch, Marvin sat on the porch like he always did, rocking in his chair whether there was a breeze or stilled air. He found the movement helped him digest the heavy meals Mother always made. Soon she'd bring out a tray filled with glasses full of ice and pitchers full of tea and lemonade for them to share. And this is how they would do most Saturdays. He was startled by the clink-clink of the ice as she poured him a tea. He'd been so deep in thought he hadn't even realized that she'd come out to join him. He sniffed the air and knew a rain was coming soon. There was something comforting about the smell of a storm before it arrived. It was distinct and acrid, an earthy smell like that of freshly cut grass, or, he just now realized, the same way it smelled right before it snowed. He imagined it must be a moisture thing. He inhaled again as he picked up the glass Mother had filled. The day would cool off soon, and he was thankful the day had been an easy one. Restless sleep and the lingering images of nightmares had turned his days weary. He sipped from the glass. He yawned. He napped in the chair as the mother put away all their dishware quietly. In the yard, the tree limbs shook gently in the wind, its leaves rustling and filling the air with their intermittent song. Below the ground, the tree's roots pumped nutrients from out of the ground and sucked up all the water that remained. The root surface pulsated from thirst. It throbbed for more and could sense that soon the sky would open up and soak the ground around it. Marvin awoke to a chilled gust of wind and the sound of clouds being ripped apart by rain and thunder. The sky swirled in angry grays, and soon the rain was coming down sideways, striking even him as he stood deep beneath the porch roof. The temperature had dropped a good 15 degrees since lunch, and the breeze carried through the entire house. The mother and Marvin scrambled around the house to shutter all the windows and doors. It was a well-built house, but water still had a way of finding its way into the most troublesome of places. Once done, the mother and Marvin found each other back in the living room and stared out into the yard, watching the rain come down and assault the property. If you had asked the right way, Marvin would have admitted he thought the tree appeared to be spreading out its limbs so it could catch every drop. The sky remained dark as the downpour lasted for hours. If one were to look out at the horizon, they'd barely be able to make out the main gravel road 100 yards away. While only 2 p.m., the day appeared like midnight and unnerved Marvin more than it normally would have. They started a fire on the hearth despite it being mid-August. The rain brought a chill that neither of them had expected so late in the summer season. The mother sat in her chair and cross-stitched, another pattern to hang up in the kitchen. Marvin sat quietly, staring into the flames as wood caught fire, turned red, then became gray ash. When another log fell apart, he'd add another to the pile. And for hours they sat in silence, enjoying the day despite being cooped up inside. Marvin's gaze wandered from the fireplace to the window, overlooking the yard outside only once, but with it came a strange dread that he couldn't reason through or rationalize. He thought he could hear a voice off in the distance, but he couldn't be sure. He didn't want to believe that a voice was now living inside his head while all the other strangeness occurred around him. But this muted and muffled voice persisted, trying to break through the haze of his attempts to ignore it. A soft ball of some material struck his face and startled him out of his reverie. "I said stop chewing at your nails, Marvin. Look at what you're doing, Lord alive," the mother said, exasperated, as she went right back to her cross-stitching. He looked at his hands and didn't recognize them. This was not a habit he'd ever had before. He certainly wasn't one of them hoity-toity boys from the city, but he made sure to clean the dirt and grime from his hands and nails before dinner every night. But this was a whole other level of strange for him. Marvin realized he'd been chewing off his fingernails nervously. A pile of the chewings, some of them bloody along their frayed edges, lay piled up in his lap. And now that he could see what he was doing, he could feel the pain left behind from the mess. He gathered up his pile of chewings and tossed them into the fire. "You good?" the mother asked as she watched him get up from his chair. He stumbled over and kissed her on the forehead. "I'm good," he replied. "Just gonna go clean up my hands is all. I never used to do this." "Mm-hmm." Marvin trudged up the stairs, pure exhaustion filling his body and wearing him down with every step. He had no reason to be exhausted. The day had been a mostly relaxing one, despite the noise of the rolling thunderstorm for hours. He and Mother had mostly stayed near the fire, occasionally falling into pleasant naps here and there despite the inconsistent booms emanating from the sky. At the top of the stairs, he could see the strange banyan tree through the bathroom window. Its silhouette was almost perfectly centered within the frame until he flipped the light on. His reflection, almost perfectly centered within the frame, replaced it. He washed his hands gingerly as the water seemed to exacerbate some of the pain briefly, soaping up each finger thoroughly. When he was done, he rummaged around and found a dark washcloth in the linen cabinet and dampened it with water. He pressed it tight against the traumatized areas, allowing the wash rag to soak up any remaining blood that might push forth, and sat down on the edge of the bathtub, sighing heavily. Unhurried, he watched the faucet allow a single drop of water to stretch out and then drip into the basin every couple of minutes. The hollow sound of the drop plinking against the metal drain and exploding against the porcelain was the only thing he could focus on as his head began to throb. When he felt the bleeding had stopped, he removed the blood-stained washcloth and began applying bandages to each finger while sitting on the edge of the tub again. He piled up the plastic backings and paper packaging from the Band-Aids on the lid of the toilet, but soon he had mended each hand successfully. The headache intensified, and soon he was holding his head in his hands, the sound of the single drip of water getting louder and louder with each successive drop. He had not heard the mother enter the bathroom, but he remembered feeling her hands alight gently on his arms as she bent down in front of him, lifted his head up out of his hands, kissed his forehead, and led him to the bedroom where, once again, she put him to rest in their marital bed. The rain clouds had come in early and turned the normally vivid sunset into a uniform gray that coated the sky from horizon to horizon for hours. Streaks of cloud marred the skyline, grew quickly in size, and gave the heavens volume and substance, filling up the space and blocking the already sparse moonlight. One could imagine thundering forces of celestial soldiers riding forth from some hidden place above, kicking up stardust in their wake as they rode forth across the earth and terrorizing those that lived on its surface. An hour later, the clouds disappeared as quickly as they came. The night was starless black. And in that unlit quiet, the tree began to grow again, Its limbs and trunk ached and creaked, growing upward and outward, the roots below drinking up the soil's moisture greedily. If you were awake and nearby, you would swear you saw its trunk expand, that you saw the bark on its exterior shift and move and allow for new bark to grow from underneath, pushing its way out. You would swear you saw the limbs extend a little more and then reach their leafy balls up to the sky as if to pray for rain. Before the sun rose, before color sparked its intent along the eastern sky, the tree seemed to shake its limbs one more time, as if readying itself for the day ahead. Sleeping birds squawked awake in surprise and flew off to power lines or fencing nearby. A single horse in the next field over shook its head and pawed its hoof against the dirt before turning back to its food. When the sun came, the enlarged banyan tree cast a shadow that engulfed the entire house. When Marvin awoke, each of the bandages wrapped around his fingers was soaked through and stained a deep reddish brown. The mother still slept beside him the way she would for about another hour, so he left the bed silently to remove the bandages. He looked back at the sheets and could see tiny spots of red here and there and knew she'd have some things to say about that when she finally came down for breakfast. Obviously, he'd offer to clean the sheets. It was his blood, after all. He sat down on the side of the tub and removed every soaked bandage, cleaned his hands and fingers thoroughly, and reapplied new bandages before he realized it was incredibly dark in the bathroom for this time of day. He looked up and saw that the tree's shadow now seemed to fill the space of the entire window. It had grown again while he slept, and he could feel anger bubbling up in the deepest parts of him, the parts that hungered for the violence needed to remove this strange impoliteness from his life. Without waking the mother, he scurried down the stairs and marched out of the house toward the tree. He nearly lost his balance on the dew-kissed lawn, focused as he was on thoughts of tearing the tree apart with his bare hands. Its limbs had lengthened and thickened, so too had its trunk. In the morning breeze, the limbs and leaves seemed to bristle at him as he approached, not unlike a warning from prey to predator. Several jostled leaves fell and spiraled down around him. He stumbled across the numerous roots that now bubbled up from below the ground, gnarling up around each other. They hinted at a massive underground structure he didn't want to think about just yet, knowing just how much work would be involved in pulling it all out when the time came. This close, the bark of the tree seemed to be moving ever so slightly, wavering and gently shifting. He pushed the thought away, deemed it ridiculous as he placed a hand against the trunk to be sure. For the briefest of moments, he felt the gentle prickling of static between him and the bark, and then, flash, his mind went blank and dark, but he could see the silhouettes of figures on the outskirts. But they were shadows of shadows, the remnants of people. Flash, a fuzzed-out memory of the boy squealing happily and running through the front yard during the start of a light rain as Marvin chased after him. Flash, several pairs of shadowy silhouetted hands reached out from the dark, their fingers curling and grasping at his clothing. Flash, replaced by silence and stillness, a calm that comes with the smell of newborn skin and the soft sighing of sleeping infant against shoulder. Flash, a feeling of a hand created from creaking and growing wood inside him, pushing up and through his organs before wrapping its fingers gingerly around his heart. Flash, and then the immediate feeling of being pulled down into the abyssal dark with no way to escape. Fingers digging into and breaking skin as his arms flail about, hoping to find anything to grab onto in order to stop his descent before flash. He opened his eyes and screamed out in pain as he fell to the ground, his knees connecting hard with the exposed roots beneath him. He pulled his hand away from the trunk of the tree and stared at it. Tiny flecks of dirt and moss and bark made divots in his palm skin before falling to the ground. His breathing was heavy and labored. The tree's surface no longer seemed to be shifting. For a moment the world was quiet, and he seemed to be able to hear every single one of his thoughts clearly. When the moment passed, Marvin wept openly and honestly. His vision blurred, and he could feel the weight of his tears forcing their way out and down his cheeks. He could feel their heat as each slid down his face and fell off his chin to land on the ground below, giving momentary shine to the dirty roots. When he was done, he used the trunk to steady himself as he stood. With clear mind and without hesitation, He kissed the trunk softly and patted it 3 times lovingly before shuffling back to the house. Had he looked up, he would have seen the mother at their bedroom window, bearing witness to it all through the gauzy drapes. As the week turned into a month, the weather began to slowly slip into the coolness of autumn. After lunch, they'd take their spots in the front porch and drink their tea or their lemonade, though it'd be hot apple cider once it got colder. They'd mostly sit in silence and smile at the near perfection of the weather, thankful to not be sweating through their clothes. Even Marvin, often hard to keep in a good mood in the best of times, seemed to have found a perpetual peace that the mother appreciated. She wondered how long his restless sleeps would keep her awake, or how many more times she'd come to find him in some kind of strange catatonic state somewhere in the house or out in the front yard with the tree. She'd grown concerned, but tried not to show it. But this was better. His fingernails were growing back because he'd stopped chewing them. He'd wake up early to do work around the property until lunch like he used to. They'd eat and sit for a while, and he'd return to property work until dinner, after which they'd enjoy another drink or two on the patio, and this was just how things went for a while. Today, they watched the leaves die. They'd started turning colors earlier than expected, but they were falling earlier than expected, too. Marvin didn't mind that they'd be a pain to rake up or mow over and turn into mulch. He was more interested in watching them fall. Their descent is what kept his attention, each one spiraling down to its final earthly demise. He thought he could smell the distinct sense of winter's chill and smoke. He had to admit that he enjoyed the color change despite the amount of work it would bring. The changing colors of the trees that served as a kind of canopy along their dirt road made for a pretty drive when out running errands or making it to church once a month. Strange streaks of gray began to creep up the massive banyan's trunk. When the mother saw this and expressed her alarm at the growth, Marvin waved her concerns away and kept drinking his warm cider as if she'd complained about it being chilly outside, which it was, but she hadn't. He could see her out of the corner of his eye, giving him a strange sideways look of concern, but Marvin didn't pay it any mind. He thought the gray gave the tree a regal kind of look, like it burning up from the inside and its outside was slowly turning to ash. As the weeks passed into November, the gray became more prominent and had very nearly consumed the entire trunk and most of the limbs. The image was stark, leafless, light gray tree limbs jutting up and out against the early evening sunsets. Marvin's curiosity had been piqued by the coloring as it seemed to somehow get deeper and richer the longer time passed. The roots had expanded farther out into the yard and made the final few yards a tough walk on his aging body. He stared up and around the banyan's trunk, admiring the view from below. Above, the cloudless and darkening sky seen through the limbs. Marvin removed one of his work gloves and put his hand against the trunk gingerly, expecting the same kind of visceral mental barrage he'd experienced 2 months previous. Instead, he felt a strange warmth emanate from within. Immediately, his mind went blank, but he could tell it was different this time. There was a comfort laced within the fabric of the connection. This time, the hands reaching out for him were soft in nature, offering help, offering guidance, offering solace? The connection released him gently and brought him back into the immediate moment. He rubbed his hand along the now smooth trunk and realized the banyan had shed its bark. Many pieces of it lay scattered about the ground around the exposed roots, themselves also smoother than they had ever been. He knew then what the gray was. He almost understood the nature of its shedding of bark skin. The tree was petrifying. It was turning into bone. Winter arrived one morning and coated the entire home in pristine and brilliant snowfall. It was the rare occasion when the mother woke up before Marvin. She put on her slippers, a thick robe, and shuffled downstairs to put wood on the fire to start breakfast. The smell of lard and bacon and eggs and toast and coffee wafted through the house, but Marvin never stirred. "Marvin, breakfast," she yelled up at the ceiling while plating food. Still, Marvin didn't wake. The mother shrugged and made him a plate anyway, putting it at his place at the table for when he finally did get to getting. She poured the coffee into a carafe and sat down, eating her breakfast slowly, savoring it as the house slowly warmed up. From her vantage in the kitchen, she could see out into the yard. Snow piled up in the corners of the window sills and gave the outside a picturesque quality. She still didn't understand the tree. She had come to distrust it the way Marvin had in the beginning, though something had clearly changed in him since. Upstairs, Marvin dreamed. In his dream, he was encased in strong, dark limbs that wrapped themselves around him, not suffocating, more embracing, as if the limbs were trying to protect him. Downstairs, the mother watched as snow continued to pile slowly on top of each and every limb. In his dream, the limbs began to change color, became gray and bone-like in feel. Downstairs, the mother thought she could see a shifting in the tree, like parts of it were coming in and out of focus. She got up and walked to the living room window. In his dream, the limbs stiffened up, hardened around his shoulders. He brought his hands up to feel them and felt them seem to shift, like the limbs were coming in and out of focus. Downstairs, the mother watched as the snow filling the limbs began to fall from each one over and over, as if the banyan was shaking itself free of it all. In his dream, Marvin breathed in and exhaled slowly, watching as the limbs around him slowly crumbled and turned into dust. He watched as the particles fell and then seemed to fly off out into the dark, leaving no trace of their existence behind. Downstairs, the mother watched as the limbs seemed to crumble and turn into dust. She watched as the particles fell and then seemed to fly off into the white, leaving no trace of their existence behind. When Marvin awoke, he smiled. A single tear appeared and rolled down his cheek onto the pillow. Without looking, he knew the banyan tree was gone from the front yard, and that this would be okay. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you really enjoyed the story. If you liked it, feel free to grab a copy of either one of my first couple of books. Links will be below in the description. And hopefully I will have the next book out by the end of next year, assuming the writing continues at the pace that it's coming. So hit subscribe if you like what you're hearing. Tell your friends. And if you would like any Bucho Gang merch, there are also links below in the description for that. Yeah, thanks for tuning in.